The funeral home was supposed to be silent, respectful, peaceful. Instead, I watched my 7-year-old daughter stand up with blood dripping between her fingers, her small voice cutting through the heavy air like broken glass. "Uncle Mike, should I read what you made me promise not to tell?" Every head in that packed room turned. My brother Mike, standing beside my son's casket in his expensive black suit, went white as paper. The funeral director froze mid-step. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, and I sat there, paralyzed, as Piper held up a crumpled piece of paper stained red with her own blood. "My name is Verena, and 3 days ago, I lost my 12-year-old son Garrett. He drowned at our family's lake house during what was supposed to be a peaceful weekend gathering. My brother Mike had been watching him, or so he claimed. Now, standing in front of 200 relatives and friends, my daughter was about to destroy everything I thought I knew about that day. Garrett had autism. To most of the world, that made him different, difficult, maybe even defective. To me, he was perfect. He could tell you the scientific name of every bird in our neighborhood, predict rain by the way the air felt, and gave the most honest hugs you'd ever receive. When he hugged you, he meant it with every cell in his body. Piper was his opposite in many ways. Where Garrett was quiet and internal, she was bold and explosive. Where he struggled with change, she embraced chaos. But they loved each other with the fierce loyalty only siblings can understand. She wore his handmade friendship bracelet today, the one with the uneven beads that he'd spent 6 hours threading because his hands didn't always cooperate. Mike had just finished telling everyone that maybe Garrett's death was a blessing, that we didn't need more broken children in the world. That my son, my beautiful, complicated, brave son, was better off dead. My parents, Frank and Dolly, had nodded along. My aunts and uncles murmured agreement. The rage in my chest was so hot I thought it might burn through my ribs. But Piper had beaten me to it. My baby girl. Standing there in her black dress that was suddenly too big for her small frame, her Mary Janes planted firmly on the funeral home's plush carpet, facing down a room full of adults who thought her brother's life had been worth less than theirs. "Garrett wasn't broken," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "He saved me from Uncle Mike, and I can prove it." The note in her hand shook, but her eyes stayed locked on Mike's face. I'd never seen my brother look afraid before. Not when he'd graduated top of his law school class. Not when he'd married Shonda in front of 500 guests. Not even when he'd called me 3 days ago to tell me Garrett had drowned. But he was afraid now. The blood from Piper's palm had started dripping onto the white carpet. She'd been gripping something inside that paper, something sharp enough to cut skin, something important enough to bleed for. The funeral director started moving toward her, but I finally found my voice. "Let her speak." Those 3 words changed everything. Mike stepped back from the casket. His wife Shonda grabbed their 3 children and pulled them closer. My father stood up, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and something that looked like dawning horror. "Verena, this is not the time," my mother Dolly whispered, but her voice wavered. She'd always known something was off about Mike. Mothers always know, even when they choose not to see. "When is the time, Mom?" I stood up, moving to stand beside Piper. "When we're burying another child? When Mike decides someone else doesn't deserve to live?" The room had become a pressure cooker. Relatives whispered frantically. Someone near the back started recording on their phone. The funeral director wrung his hands, clearly unprepared for this in all his years of managing grief. Piper unfolded the note, with careful precision, leaving bloody fingerprints on the edges. Inside, wrapped in Garrett's distinctive handwriting, was a small piece of metal. A button from Mike's jacket, the one with his law firm's distinctive eagle emblem, the one that had gone missing the day Garrett died. "My brother wrote this the morning he died," Piper announced. "He knew something bad would happen. He knew because Uncle Mike had tried before. Mike made one last attempt at control." She's traumatized, confused. Children make things up when they're grieving. But Piper, my warrior daughter, just smiled the saddest smile I'd ever seen on a 7-year-old face. "Garrett said you'd say that. That's why he told me to keep the button you lost when you held him under the water. He bit your hand and grabbed it while you were drowning him. He hid it in his pocket. He gave it to me before you took him to the lake that last time." The funeral home erupted into chaos, but all I could hear was the sound of my son's voice in my head. The last thing he'd said to me that morning, "Mom, If something happens to me, remember I was brave. Remember I protected her. Remember I'm not broken. I hadn't understood then. I understood now. The morning of Garrett's funeral arrived, wrapped in fog so thick I couldn't see the neighbor's house. I stood in my bedroom at 6 a.m., already dressed, watching Piper sleep in my bed where she'd been staying since Garrett died. She'd refused to sleep in her own room, said it was too quiet without hearing Garrett's humming through the wall. He used to hum the same 3 notes over and over when he was happy, a sound that drove visitors crazy but had become the soundtrack of our home. "Mommy?" Piper's eyes fluttered open. "Do I have to wear the scratchy dress?" "Just for a few hours, baby." I sat on the bed's edge, smoothing her tangled hair. "Then we can come home and put on pajamas." Garrett hated scratchy clothes. Her bottom lip trembled. "Remember how he only wore those 4 dinosaur shirts?" I remembered. God, I remembered everything. The way he sorted his cereal by color before eating. How he watched the Weather Channel for exactly 43 minutes every morning. The way he discovered that Piper was afraid of thunderstorms before she ever told anyone and would crawl into her bed to sing the periodic table song until she fell asleep. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother, Dolly. "We're bringing the photo boards." Mike offered to speak. "He's prepared something special." Special. My brother Mike's version of special usually meant making sure everyone knew how successful his law firm was or how his children had won another academic trophy. He'd never understood Garrett. Never tried to. Last Christmas, when Garrett had a meltdown because the tree lights were a different color than the previous year, Mike had pulled me aside to suggest professional intervention and considering long-term care options. "He's 12, Mike," I'd told him. "Not a problem to be solved. Be realistic, Verena. What happens when he's 20, 30? You can't manage him forever." But I would have. I would have managed him forever if it meant hearing his detailed explanations about cloud formations one more time. The doorbell rang at 7:30. Mike stood on my porch with his wife Shonda and their 3 children, Michael Jr., 15 and headed to Harvard, Bethany, 13 and already a state champion in debate, and Cole, 10, and the star of his travel soccer team. Everything Mike believed children should be. "How are you holding up?" Shonda asked, air kissing my cheek while keeping her distance. She'd always acted like Garrett's autism might be contagious, keeping her kids from spending too much time with him. "We're managing." I watched Mike kneel beside Piper in the living room, whispering something that made her shoulders tense. "What are you telling her?" I started toward them. Mike stood smoothly. "Just reminding her that today will be hard, and sometimes when we're sad, we might remember things wrong. It's important to focus on the good memories." Piper pressed herself against the wall, clutching something in her small fist. I should have noticed the way she wouldn't meet his eyes. Should have seen how Mike's children exchanged glances, how Bethany particularly seemed to shrink when her father touched her shoulder. The funeral home had been our grandfather's choice when he died 5 years ago, all mahogany and burgundy carpets, heavy with the smell of lilies and furniture polish. By 9:30, it was packed. My father Frank stood at the entrance, shaking hands and accepting condolences with the same businesslike efficiency he'd used running his hardware store for 40 years. "Terrible accident," he repeated to each person. "These things happen. God's plan." But it wasn't God's plan. God didn't plan for 12-year-old boys to drown in 3 feet of water while their uncle was supposedly watching them. God didn't plan for mothers to get calls that their son's body had been found floating by the dock, his weighted vest somehow removed, the one thing that helped him feel calm in water. I dressed Garrett in his favorite dinosaur shirt, the soft one with the triceratops that he'd worn until it was nearly transparent. The funeral director had suggested a suit, but I'd refused. Garrett had worn a suit exactly once, to my cousin's wedding, and had spent the entire reception hiding under the gift table, overwhelmed by the collar against his neck. The casket was open, which I'd fought against but lost. My mother insisted people needed to say goodbye properly, but that still, waxy figure wasn't my son. Garrett was movement and sound, constant motion even in sleep, fingers tapping out patterns only he understood. This stillness was wrong, was everything Garrett had never been. As relatives filled the pews, I heard the whispers starting, about how I'd handle Piper alone. Now, about how difficult the last 12 years must have been. about God's mercy in taking Garrett before he became unmanageable. Not one person whispered about how he'd taught himself to read at 3, hyper-focused on astronomy books until he could name every constellation. Not one mentioned his perfect pitch or his ability to remember every conversation he'd ever had word for word. They didn't whisper about his gentle hands rescuing beetles from sidewalks, or how he'd spent 6 months learning to braid so he could do Piper's hair when I was sick. They only whispered about what he couldn't do, never about what he could. The funeral service began with a hymn that Garrett would have hated. Too many voices singing off-key, the organ too loud, the acoustic chaos that used to make him cover his ears and rock in his seat. My Aunt Helen sang the loudest, her warbling soprano cutting through everything else, probably thinking she was honoring him. She'd never once lowered her voice when Garrett asked, never understood that her perfume made him physically sick, never grasped that her surprise hugs felt like attacks to his nervous system. Pastor Williams spoke about heaven and angels, about God calling his special children home, generic words that could have been about anyone. He'd met Garrett exactly twice, both times commenting afterward about what a handful he must be. I stared at a water stain on the ceiling, counting the edges to keep from screaming. Then Mike stood up. He walked to the podium with the confident stride of a man who'd never been told he was wrong. His black suit cost more than I made in a month at the library. His shoes clicked against the floor in a rhythm that Garrett would have found unsettling. Everything about Mike was calculated to project success, normalcy, the life he believed everyone should want. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his lawyer voice filling the space. "Today we gather to remember Garrett, my nephew, who faced challenges none of us can truly understand." My mother nodded, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. My father sat rigid, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. "Garrett was special," Mike continued, emphasizing the word in a way that drained it of warmth. "Different. He lived in a world we couldn't always reach, spoke a language we couldn't always understand. His mother, my sister Verena, showed extraordinary patience dealing with his daily needs, his outbursts, his limitations." Limitations. Garrett could calculate the distance between stars in his head. He knew the migration pattern of every bird species in North America. He'd memorized the entire bus system route map because Piper mentioned wanting to ride the city bus someday. But sure, let's talk about limitations. As many of you know, raising a child with autism is extremely challenging. The financial burden, the emotional toll, the sacrifice of a normal family life. Verena gave up her career, her social life, her future relationships, all to manage Garrett's needs. I hadn't given up anything. I'd chosen my son, chosen to see the world through his extraordinary lens, chosen to learn his language instead of forcing him to learn mine. But Mike was building to something. I could feel it in the way he gripped the podium edges. "Death is always tragic," he said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was sympathetic. "But sometimes, God has a plan we don't understand." Garrett was never going to have a normal life, never going to have a job, a family, independence. The stark reality is that he would have become increasingly difficult to manage as he grew older and stronger. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some of agreement, some of shock. I saw my cousin Janet nod slowly, remembering probably the Thanksgiving when Garrett had hidden under the table because someone had moved his designated plate. "What I'm saying," Mike continued, "and I know this is hard to hear, but perhaps it's good. He died young. We don't need more broken kids in this world who can't contribute, who'll never have normal lives, who burden their families for decades." The words hit like physical blows. Each one a nail in my chest. My beautiful boy, who'd spent hours teaching himself origami to make paper birds for the elderly residents at the nursing home where we volunteered, who'd noticed that Mrs. Chen always sat alone and made a point to share his goldfish crackers with her every week, who'd created an entire filing system for the food bank because he noticed their current system was inefficient. "That's enough, Mike." I started to stand, my legs shaking with rage, but my father's hand clamped down on my wrist, his mechanic's grip still strong at 68. "Don't make a scene, Verena. He's not wrong. You know we all worried about Garrett's future." My Aunt Helen leaned forward from the row behind. "At least now you can focus on Piper. Give her a normal life, maybe even find a husband without the baggage." Baggage. My son was baggage. You never understood him. I hissed, trying to pull free from my father's grip. "None of you even tried." "We tried plenty," my mother whispered sharply. "Birthday parties he ruined with his screaming, holidays where we had to change every tradition, walking on eggshells in our own homes." Mike was still talking, painting a picture of a future that would never be. Verena can now rebuild her life. Piper can have a childhood without being overshadowed by her brother's needs. Our family can gather without planning every detail around Garrett's triggers. That's when I noticed Piper had gone completely rigid beside me. Her face was white, her small hands balled into fists so tight her knuckles looked like tiny mountain peaks. She was staring at Mike with an expression I'd never seen before. Not grief, not sadness, but pure, crystallized rage. "Stop," she whispered, but her voice carried in the hushed room. Mike paused, seemingly surprised. "Piper, sweetheart, I know this is hard to understand. You're lying." Her voice was stronger now. "You're lying about everything." The room went silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Mike's face shifted, a flash of something dark crossing his features before returning to practiced concern. "Children process grief differently," he said to the crowd, but his eyes never left Piper's face. "Perhaps we should take a break." Number Piper stood up, and that's when I saw the red seeping between her clenched fingers. "You don't get to lie about my brother anymore." Piper's blood dripped onto the burgundy carpet in small, perfect circles. She stood there, all 48 pounds of her, facing down a room full of adults who had just agreed her brother's death was a blessing. Her Sunday dress, the one I'd ironed so carefully that morning, had a spreading red stain where she'd pressed her fist against her side. "Piper, sit down." Mike's voice had changed, dropped the false sympathy, and turned cold as winter concrete. "You're confused, sweetheart. Remember what we talked about this morning?" "I remember everything." Piper lifted her chin, and for a moment she looked exactly like Garrett when he'd decided something was worth fighting for. "You said if I told anyone about the lake, you'd make sure Mom lost me too. You said no one would believe a sad little girl over a successful lawyer." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Shonda grabbed Mike's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. "What is she talking about?" Mike forced a laugh that fooled no one. "She's traumatized. Children create fantasies when they can't process loss." "Stop lying!" Piper's shout echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "My brother wasn't broken. He saved me. He saved me from Uncle Mike." I stood up so fast my father's grip couldn't stop me. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. The way Garrett had begged not to go to the lake with Mike alone. How he'd tried to tell me something that morning but couldn't get the words out, just kept repeating, Piper safe, while pacing his room. "What did you do?" I moved toward Mike, but Pastor Williams stepped between us. "Let's all calm down," the pastor said, hands raised. "This is a place of worship." "This is a place of truth," Piper said, her voice steady now despite the tears streaming down her face. "And the truth is, Uncle Mike hurt Garrett because Garrett wouldn't let him hurt me." My mother stood up, her face pale. "Michael, what is this child saying?" "She's saying exactly what you think she's saying, Mom." The words came from an unexpected source. Bethany, Mike's 13-year-old daughter, stood up in her pew. "Dad's been doing things." Garrett saw him. That's why Dad made sure Garrett drowned. The funeral home erupted. Shonda screamed something at Mike that got lost in the chaos. My father released my wrist to lunge at Mike himself, 70 years of controlled emotion exploding at once. People were standing, shouting, phones appearing to record the unfolding disaster. But Piper wasn't done. She raised her bloody fist higher, the crumpled paper visible between her fingers. "Should I read what Garrett wrote? Should I read what you made me promise not to tell? The note about what really happened at the lake?" Mike tried to move toward her, but 3 of my cousins blocked his path. Marcus, who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, looked ready to take Mike apart piece by piece. "He's lying about the cabin," Piper continued, her child's voice cutting through the adult chaos. "He wasn't inside when Garrett drowned. He was in the water. Garrett has marks on his shoulders from Uncle Mike's hands. I saw them when Mom was getting him ready for the funeral. Finger marks, 10 of them. I had seen them. The funeral director had asked about them, and I'd assumed they were from someone trying to save him, but the pattern, it was wrong for rescue. The bruises were positioned to push down, not pull up. Garrett followed us into the woods, Piper said, each word deliberate and clear. Uncle Mike had been watching me all weekend, Garrett noticed. He always noticed things like that. Uncle Mike said he wanted to show me a special place, but Garrett knew something was wrong. My brilliant, observant son. He'd seen what none of us had wanted to see. He'd recognized a predator's patterns because patterns were his language, his way of understanding the world. When Uncle Mike put his hand over my mouth, Garrett hit him with a stick. Not just once. Over and over, screaming at me to run. He couldn't fight good because his body doesn't work like other people's, but he tried. He kept trying even when Uncle Mike dragged him to the lake. The image burned into my mind. My son, who struggled with coordination, who couldn't catch a ball or ride a bike, fighting a grown man to save his sister. His courage had nothing to do with physical ability and everything to do with love. I hid in the locked bathroom in the cabin, Piper continued. I heard them at the dock. Garrett was screaming my name, telling me to stay hidden, then the screaming stopped. When Uncle Mike came back, his clothes were all wet and he was missing a button from his jacket. He said if I ever told anyone, he'd make sure everyone knew I was a liar, just like my broken brother. She opened her fist then, revealing not just the blood-stained paper, but something else. A button with an eagle emblem, the kind found only on Mike's custom-made suits from his expensive Italian tailor. Garrett bit Uncle Mike's hand and tore this off while fighting, Piper said. He shoved it in his pocket even while drowning. When they brought him back to the cabin, when Uncle Mike was calling 911 and pretending to cry, I took it from Garrett's pocket. He was still wet, still cold, but his hand was closed around it so tight I had to pry his fingers open. The funeral home had gone silent except for the sound of Mike's ragged breathing. He stood trapped between the cousins who'd blocked him and the reality closing in from all sides. My brother died protecting me, Piper said, looking directly at Mike. He was more brave than anyone in this room. He was worth 1,000,000 of you. Piper carefully unfolded the blood-stained paper, her small fingers trembling but determined. The funeral home had become so quiet I could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Mike's face had turned the color of old paper, his eyes darting between the exits and the men blocking them. My brother wrote this the morning he died, Piper announced, holding the note up. He gave it to me when Uncle Mike said they were going fishing. He made me promise to hide it unless something bad happened. She began to read in her clear, 7-year-old voice, but the words belonged to Garrett, each one carved into my heart. If something happens to me, Uncle Mike did it. He said Piper is pretty and when she's older he wants to make her his special friend like he tried with me. I said no and pushed him when he touched me wrong. He said broken kids like me shouldn't exist. He said he'd hurt Piper if I told. I'm scared. I love you, Mom. I love you, Piper. I'm not broken. Love, Garrett. The note shook in her hands as she continued with her own story. Garrett saw Uncle Mike following me to the woods path. He dropped his dinosaur book and ran after us. He hated the woods because they're too loud, too many birds and bugs and leaves, but he came anyway. My mother collapsed into her pew, her hand over her mouth. My father stood frozen, his face cycling through expressions I'd never seen before. Uncle Mike had his hand on my mouth, Piper continued, and his other hand was pulling at my dress. Garrett hit him with a big stick, right in the head. There was blood. Uncle Mike let go, and Garrett kept hitting him, screaming, "Run, Piper, run! Piper, run!" He'd never screamed that loud before. It hurt my ears, but I ran. Bethany suddenly spoke up again, her voice shaking. That's why Dad had that cut on his temple. He said he hit it on the boat, but boats don't leave scratches like stick marks. Mike lunged toward his daughter, but Marcus clotheslined him, sending him sprawling onto the funeral home floor. "Stay down," Marcus growled. "Or I'll make you stay down." Piper wasn't finished. I locked myself in the cabin bathroom. I heard them at the dock. Garrett was screaming that he'd tell everyone, that Uncle Mike was bad, that touching kids was wrong. Then I heard splashing. So much splashing. And Garrett's voice got quieter and quieter until it was gone. She held up the eagle button, its gold surface catching the light. Uncle Mike came back 20 minutes later. His shirt was torn here. She pointed to her chest, and he was breathing funny. He knocked on the bathroom door and said Garrett had an accident, that he fell in the water, but I could see through the keyhole. He was all wet, not just his arms like if he'd pulled someone out. All of him, like he'd been in the water too. The funeral director had called 911. I could hear sirens in the distance getting closer. Mike tried to stand, but Marcus planted a foot on his chest. "There's more," Piper said, her voice getting stronger. "Garrett taught me to be observant like him, to notice patterns. Uncle Mike has a pattern. He touched cousin Amy at Christmas 2 years ago," she told her mom, but no one believed her. "He tried with Rebecca from church, but she's older and fought him off. He told them what he told me, that no one believes kids over successful adults." Amy's mother gasped from the back row. Rebecca's family was sitting 3 rows behind us, and I saw Rebecca, now 16, nod slowly, tears streaming down her face. "Garrett kept a notebook," Piper continued. "He wrote down every time Uncle Mike did something wrong, every weird touch, every strange comment, every time he got us alone. It's hidden in his dinosaur collection box under his bed. He said if anything happened to him, I should show it to the police." Shonda had started sobbing, pulling her children away from Mike. "The sleepovers," she whispered. "All those times you volunteered to watch the kids. Oh God, our own children." Michael Jr., 15 and supposed to be Harvard-bound, spoke for the first time. "He never touched me, but he said things, showed me pictures, said it was normal, just guy stuff, but I should keep it between us." The police arrived then, 4 officers entering the funeral home with their hands on their weapons. Someone had briefed them on the situation because they went straight to Mike, hauling him to his feet. "Garrett fought for 12 minutes, Piper said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I timed it on the kitchen clock through the keyhole. 12 minutes of fighting in the water, even though swimming was hard for him. He fought until he couldn't anymore because he promised to protect me. My brother wasn't broken. He was a hero." As the police read Mike his rights, Piper walked to Garrett's casket. She placed the note inside, next to his hand, the one that had held that button even while drowning. "You did it," she whispered to him. "You saved me. You saved all of us." She then turned to face the room, blood still on her hand, tears on her cheeks, but standing taller than any 7-year-old should have to stand. "My brother was different, not broken. He saw things you all missed. He protected people you failed to protect. He was worth more than all of you who thought his death was a blessing. Remember that. Remember that the broken one wasn't him. It was all of you who couldn't see past different to find extraordinary." The police arrested Mike that day in front of everyone. He didn't fight or protest, just kept his head down as they led him past his sobbing wife and traumatized children. The investigation that followed revealed everything Piper had said was true, and more. The medical examiner found water in Garrett's lungs consistent with forced drowning. His fingernails had Mike's DNA underneath them. The pattern of bruises on his shoulders matched someone holding him underwater from above. They found Garrett's notebook exactly where Piper said it would be, tucked inside his dinosaur collection box between a velociraptor and a brachiosaurus. 5 years of observations written in his careful handwriting. Times, dates, specific incidents. Uncle Mike touched Amy's leg 47 times during Christmas dinner. Uncle Mike went into Bethany's room at 2:17 a.m. and stayed for 31 minutes. Uncle Mike showed Michael Jr. bad pictures on his phone for 1-2 minutes while Aunt Shonda was shopping. My son had been building a case like a detective, documenting patterns everyone else refused to see. Mike got 25 to life. During the trial, 7 more victims came forward, some from his law firm, others from the youth basketball team he'd coached. Each one had been told the same thing. No one would believe them over such a successful, respected man. But they believed Garrett's notes. They believed Piper's courage. They believed the truth that a 12-year-old boy with autism had seen what an entire community had missed. 3 months after the funeral, I stood with Piper at Garrett's grave. She'd insisted on bringing new flowers, bright yellow sunflowers, because Garrett had memorized the Fibonacci sequence in their seed patterns. She also brought a laminated copy of a news article where the district attorney called Garrett a hero who'd saved countless children through his documentation and sacrifice. "Mom," Piper said, arranging the sunflowers carefully, Why did everyone think Garrett being different meant he was broken? I knelt beside her on the grass, choosing my words with the same care Garrett used to choose his dinosaur shirts. People fear what they don't understand, baby. Garrett's brain worked differently, but that difference let him see things others couldn't. He noticed Uncle Mike's patterns, because patterns were how he understood the world. What they called a deficit was actually his superpower. Like how he always knew when I had a bad dream even before I woke up, exactly like that. And how he could tell it would rain by the way the air pressure changed. And how he memorized every bus route to make sure you'd never get lost. My parents had tried to apologize, but some wounds don't heal with sorry. They'd chosen comfort over truth, their idea of normal over their grandson's life. My mother still sent letters I didn't open. My father left voicemails I deleted. They'd believed Garrett was better off dead rather than different. There was no coming back from that. But something beautiful had grown from the horror. Piper started a journal like Garrett's, not to document crimes but to notice the unnoticed. She wrote about the kid who ate lunch alone, the teacher who seemed sad, the janitor who hummed the same song Garrett used to hum. At 7 years old, she'd learned to see the world through her brother's lens, to find the extraordinary in what others dismissed. Garrett's story went viral after the trial, not as inspiration porn about a disabled child, but as a wake-up call about how society fails to protect and value different minds. 3 states passed Garrett's Law, requiring schools to take children's reports of abuse seriously, regardless of the child's developmental status. His notebook became a training tool for prosecutors, showing how detailed documentation from an unexpected source could build an airtight case. The lake house was sold. Mike's assets were liquidated for victim compensation. Shonda moved across the country with her children, all of whom entered therapy. Michael Jr. sent me a letter thanking Garrett for saving him and his siblings from worse trauma. He got into Harvard on his own merit, writing his entrance essay about how a cousin with autism taught him that heroes don't always look like what we expect. Rebecca, the girl from church Piper had mentioned, became an advocate for abuse survivors. She often said that Garrett's willingness to fight despite his physical limitations gave her the courage to speak despite her emotional ones. On what would have been Garrett's 13th birthday, Piper and I released 13 balloons at his grave, each one carrying a fact about him that had nothing to do with autism and everything to do with who he was. How he loved dinosaurs, how he made the best paper airplanes, how he gave the most honest hugs, how he died the way he lived, protecting others with everything he had. The last balloon carried a simple message in Piper's handwriting. Different doesn't mean broken. It means brave enough to be yourself in a world that wants you to be someone else. Garrett was never broken. The broken ones were those who couldn't see his worth, who measured his value by their narrow definition of normal, who thought the world would be better without minds like his. But Garrett saw what they couldn't. He saved who they wouldn't. He loved in ways they didn't understand. My son died a hero, not despite his differences, but because of them. He noticed patterns others missed, documented truth others ignored, and fought battles others didn't even know existed. He saved his sister and countless other children with his observations, his courage, and his refusal to let different mean less than. The world needs more Garretts. Children who see differently, think differently, love differently, because sometimes it takes a different lens to see the dangers hiding in plain sight. Sometimes it takes someone who doesn't fit in to stand out when it matters most. Garrett taught us that broken isn't about how your brain works or how your body moves. Broken is seeing someone different and wishing they didn't exist. Broken is valuing normal over remarkable. Broken is thinking that a child who memorized constellation patterns and made paper birds for lonely elderly people and fought a grown man to save his sister was somehow worth less than children who could catch balls and make small talk. My son wasn't broken. He was extraordinary. And 12 minutes of fighting in that lake proved what a lifetime of ignorant whispers never understood. Different kids don't need to be fixed. They need to be seen, heard, protected, and valued for exactly who they are, because sometimes they're the only ones watching closely enough to save us all. Thank you for watching this story. If it moved you, please share it with others who need to hear that different doesn't mean less than. Leave a comment about someone in your life who sees the world differently and makes it better because of it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us to look beyond the surface and find the extraordinary in the unexpected. Remember, the people who don't fit in are often the ones who stand out when it matters most.